So we can get started. I think we have a quorum here. Welcome everyone to the 26th meeting of the Board of Health. Welcome to members of the board and to other members of council. There aren't any who are in attendance today, and of course to members of the public. For those in the room with us, the screen at the back there says where we are at with the real-time updates and what's coming next. If you leave and are in another place anywhere in the world, you can watch us. Not that you would want to, but you can watch us on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. And I can say that I've watched committee hearings all over the place, all over the world as to what's happening here. So it's live cast. The Board of Health gratefully acknowledge it is meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous peoples. First thing is the confirmation of the minutes from March the 5th, 2018. I'll ask Councillor Cressy to move them. It's their confirmation. Anyone holding it? No. All in favor of their confirmation? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Are there any declarations of interest pursuant to the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none. We'll go through the agenda, more rapid fire, and then we'll go back to the ones that are held. So, 26.1, reaffirming City of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone. We have 8 deputants, so we will hold that to hear them out. Second is deaths of people experiencing homelessness, 2017 review. We have a deputation there, so we'll hold for that purpose. Number 3, City Council approved Toronto Public Health 2018 to 2027 capital budget plan. This is for receipt for information. Moved by Angela Johnson. Any debate or discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, opposed if any, carried. 26.4, City of Council approved 2018 operating budget. Now, I'm going to hold that. We have a very nice little piece of correspondence that the Medical Officer of Health will share with us. So I'll hold that. And the letter is being distributed?
Yes, that will be short.
Yeah, great. Thank you. 26.5, Toronto Public Health operating budget variance for the 12 months ending December 31st, 2017. Last year's year end, moved by Councillor Cressy, that is receipt. All in favor, opposed if any, that's carried. 26.6, Toronto Public Health capital budget variance for the 12 months ending December 31st, 2017. Moved by Councillor Doucette, Vice Chair Doucette. All in favor, opposed if any, that's carried. The next item is the 26.7, 2017 performance appraisal, Medical Officer of Health. You have some documents there in purple paper. Does anyone want to hold them, or are we okay with their recommendations? Happy to move it. Seeing no holds. Going once, going twice. All in favor, opposed if any, that's carried. I think our city manager was supposed to be here for the item, but she's probably watching from afar, and so she doesn't need to be. So that is done, and we'll chat afterwards. Okay. There is an added item on the federal tobacco control strategy on pink paper. I'd ask that it be introduced. This came via another city council, I think Montreal. So I'll ask that we support putting this on the agenda. All in favor, opposed if any, that's carried. Okay, so we can go back to the top of the agenda. The first item is reaffirming City of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone. This has come to us via City Council as a motion from Councillor Chin Lee and Mayor Tory. So we have a series of deputants. I've been asked to reorder them, and so with the Board of Health support, we're going to start with Setsuko Thurlow, followed by Frank Summers, Vinay Jindal for Physician for Global Survival, Rosemary Keenan and Sister Mary Ellen Francoeur for Pax Christi, Lynn Adamson for Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, Rob Atchison for Science for Peace, and Anna Jakaran as the speaker. If I miss anyone, then we'll catch them as we go through. We'll just affirm them as we go through them. Thank you very much. Setsuko Thurlow, you're invited to come up here. I understand you have a little bit of a presentation to make. And while we have done this as council, I don't think we've done it as a Board of Health. Setsuko Thurlow was one of the recipients of the 2017, 2018, 17 Nobel Peace Prize recipient. We are honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Welcome, Setsuko.
Thank you very much. I am Setsuko Thurlow, speaking on behalf of the Hiroshima-Nagasaki Day Coalition. We have been organizing the remembrance of the first atomic bombings in the City Hall Peace Garden every August for 4 decades. Your paper has 3 decades. Please change it to 4. City councilors have participated in these commemorations by reading the mayor's annual Hiroshima-Nagasaki Day peace message. I am honored that Mayor Tori and the City Council recognized my work for the abolition of nuclear weapons last November, when City Council reaffirmed Toronto as a nuclear weapon-free zone. On August 6, 1945, one atomic bomb, which was smaller and obsolete by today's standards, fueled by uranium from Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories and refined in Port Hope, Ontario, detonated over me and 360,000 residents of Hiroshima, most of whom were innocent civilians, women, children, and elderly. This indiscriminate attack vaporized, incinerated, carbonized, and contaminated people with mysterious radiation poison. Thus, my beloved city of Hiroshima was wiped out from the face of the earth with a heat of 4,000 degrees Celsius. I have lived in this blessed country for over 60 years, and I am a proud and grateful citizen of Canada. I enjoyed a fulfilling professional career as a social worker in Toronto. But throughout my adult life, my major effort has been devoted to disarmament, education, and advocacy. In the mid-1970s, my husband James Thurlow and I, and a small group of professors and religious leaders, founded Hiroshima Nagasaki Relived to inform Torontonians about the horrendous effects of nuclear weapons on cities and civilians. We are grateful when, in 1982, the Toronto Board of Health consulted our and other Toronto peace groups and issued the report entitled Public Health Consequences of Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear War. This report was adopted by both the Board of Health and Toronto City Council. It urged that the city Council accept an ongoing responsibility to deal with the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and make a number of recommendations subsequently implemented by Toronto City Council. Council voted to hold the referendum on worldwide nuclear disarmament in the November 8, 1982 municipal election. The report, Public Health Consequences of Nuclear Weapon and Nuclear War, was distributed to all Toronto households as information for the referendum. In November 1982, 79%, by the way, that's another mistake. Please correct it, not 78. It should be 79% of Torontonians who cast ballots in the municipal election voted yes to the following resolution. Do you support nuclear disarmament by all nations on a gradual basis to the ultimate goal of the world free from nuclear weapons? And mandate your federal government to negotiate and implement with other governments steps which would lead to the earliest possible achievement of this goal. City Council forwarded the result of the referendum to the federal government. In 1983, City Council designated Toronto a nuclear weapon-free zone and adopted the Intercity Solidarity Program proposed by the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus becoming a member of Mayor for Peace. Council also approved the building of the Peace Garden on the Nathan Phillips Square at the cost of $480,000 as an expression of our continuing struggle to avoid the devastation of war. In 1988, City Council approved the report of Healthy Toronto 2000, which specifically referred to questions of safety, security, and peace. Therefore, again, accepting that the city is accountable for the immediate personal security of its citizens. Today, 15,000 nuclear weapons still endanger the very existence of cities such as Toronto, and indeed, all of human civilization. As a Hiroshima survivor, I urge you to examine the evidence brought before you by peace, faith, medical, and environmental community organizations active in the worldwide effort to abolish nuclear arms. I have requested the City Clerk's office circulate the 1982 Public Health Consequences of Nuclear Weapon and Nuclear War report to the current Board of Health members so that you can consider what recommendations the board may make to City Council today. In 1982, the board and City Council concluded that Toronto was targeted by nuclear missile and would be catastrophically affected by radiation fallout from nuclear explosions in the United States. They also concluded that there's no civil defense against nuclear weapons or possible evacuation from major urban areas at a time of nuclear confrontation. There is only one effective form of civil defense, the 1982 report concluded, and that is to use the political process to bring about arms control, a lowering of tension, and eventually nuclear disarmament. Your recommendations today could include reaffirming that the City Council has an ongoing responsibility to deal with the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and that the city participate actively in Mayors for Peace, which now has over 7,500 members in 163 countries and regions. You could also recommend that City Council urge the federal government to sign the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I was honored to accept the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, awarded to ICANN in Oslo in December. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to the Board of Health on this issue, the issue vital to our very existence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Setsuko. Just hold on one second. Are there any questions of Setsuko? And let me just say thank you very much, Setsuko. May I just say on a personal note, I had the fortune of listening to you in, I think it was 1979. And I think, frankly, and that introduced me to the peace movement at that time. And I'm so familiar with all those events that you spoke of and those petitions and those things that we did in the early 80s. And I think we're blessed in Canada for having you amongst us and for the good work that you've done, not just in Canada, but globally. Thank you for coming. Our next deputant is Frank Summers. Dr. Frank Summers is with Physicians for Social Responsibility. Welcome, Dr. Summers. I remember you too.
We're getting on.
We are. Just by the way, the rule here, the procedural rule is a 5-minute deputation. So you're going to see me going like this at about a few seconds before 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board, for the opportunity to once again express our strong support for reaffirming City of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone, as we did with your predecessors in 1982. I'm Dr. Frank Summers, Honorary and Founding President of Physicians for Social Responsibility, today known as Physicians for Global Survival, which began in 1979 in Toronto, became countrywide, and the Canadian affiliate of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in 1981. Our work was honored by the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. I am the organizer of the conference in 1981 at the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine of the Conference on the Medical Consequences of Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear War, which led to the data sheet which formed the backbone of the pamphlet that we helped the City of Toronto to prepare for every household. Contemplating the finality of our own life is painful. There are limits to our thinking. How on earth do we really think about the imminent demise of ourselves, our wives, our husbands, our children? How do we conceptualize an event without parallel in human history? The cataclysmic extinction of our institutions, the vaporization of our homes, offices, hospitals, the extinction of life as we know it. Our need for a sense of linkage to the future is very important. Through our work, our art, our children, the doomsday potential threatens the extinction of all of these that carry on our efforts for the future. The exertion of effort in the present must be somewhat related to a sense of being worthwhile. The finality of deaths of the self, of one's loved ones, and one's culture puts this sense at grave risk. Furthermore, there is a system of denial, which as a psychiatrist I often see used, an unconscious defense mechanism whose purpose is to dampen an aspect of external reality or actually to reject it. Confronting the reality of the nuclear threat is depressing, to say the least. The chances are that the people who have not explored the facts will not be keen to hear those who have. Coping with the vicissitudes of daily life places sufficient burden on most of us. There is a tendency to not hear, to dismiss, or worse, to label as naive or idealistic or one-sided the bearers of uncomfortable facts. Since the psychological mechanism of denial is working, each of us needs to consciously work at overcoming our own personal denial and then to alleviate the ensuing danger of possible depression by becoming active in the search for solutions. Another crucial consideration is the effect of the nuclear threat on children. A task force of the American Psychiatric Association, whose local branch I just completed a term as president, on the psychosocial impact of nuclear advances, reported on interviews with hundreds of students. Quote, the teenagers have not submerged or camouflaged their feelings of helplessness about the nuclear threat as most adults have learned to do. They may be showing us that growing up in a world dominated by the threat of imminent nuclear destruction is having an impact on the structure of personality itself. We may be raising a generation of young people denied the basis for making long-term commitments and serviceable ideals, given over of necessity to doctrines of impulsivity and immediacy in their personal relationships and their choice of activities, behaviors, and occupations. How can we help our young people grow into some promise of certainty and fulfillment unless we adults address the apathy and helplessness we experience in the face of the arms race and the threat of nuclear annihilation? A local Toronto study, Children in Fear of Nuclear War, showed that youngsters aged 12 to 18 felt the threat of nuclear war to be their greatest worry, with future employment prospects also a significant concern. Subsequent studies in other countries echoed these findings. In 1983, during lunch at 24 Sussex in Ottawa, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau leaned closer and said to me, quote, Frank, on this issue, we cannot lead. We cannot lead. You have to push us, unquote. He was referring to the nuclear threat. Shortly after, he left, although suggested I stay on, to take little Justin to judo class. As the organizer of next weekend's inaugural training course in disaster psychiatry, I have learned that the most important element is preparation. We call nuclear war the ultimate epidemic for which prevention is the only cure. Your work here today can contribute to the prevention by resoundingly sending the message that Toronto chooses to affirm its status as a nuclear weapons-free zone. In 1982, the Board of Health, the mayor, at that time Art Eggleton, I remember getting his support very kindly, and Toronto City Council of the time listened to our plea and chose to become active against the forces of nuclear annihilation. The information before you is proof that today you have an opportunity to reaffirm that choice, thereby affirming life over death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll invite our next deputant, Vinay Jindal, for Physicians for Global Survival.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So according to the World Medical Association statement on nuclear weapons, which was amended in 2015, the medical profession has a duty to preserve and safeguard the health of the patient, and as such has a duty to work for the elimination of nuclear weapons. The Canadian Medical Association endorsed this statement in February 2016, representing over 85,000 physicians across Canada. The Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada and the College of Family Physicians of Canada both endorsed the same statement in 2017. Physicians across Canada and across the globe recognize the unacceptable risks of nuclear weapons and pledge to work toward their elimination as part of the physician's responsibility to serve humanity. Today, I come to you as a physician, as a Torontonian, and as the President of Physicians for Global Survival Canada to discuss the important role our city must play in educating the citizens on the dangers of nuclear weapons. And as a physician, when it comes to the nuclear threat, prevention is the only way. In 2011, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement released a statement entitled "Working Towards the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons," and it recognized the destructive power of nuclear weapons, the unspeakable human suffering they cause, and the impossibility of any adequate humanitarian response. It is just not possible. Prevention is the only way. And the consequences of nuclear weapons use will be global and devastating. In 2013, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War released a booklet called Nuclear Famine, 2 Billion People at Risk. This document outlined the global climate disruption expected from a limited regional nuclear war involving only 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs, or less than 0.5% of today's nuclear arsenal. The fallout from such a limited nuclear war would lead to an average global drop in temperature of only 1.25 degrees Celsius. But that small change in temperature would have a huge impact on agriculture and food supplies that would put a significant portion of the world's population at risk of famine. But for Toronto, the stakes are even higher. Toronto is a rich city in a rich country. Toronto might not starve, but Toronto will suffer. The multicultural fabric that makes Toronto great does not provide for an us versus them attitude. We are one, we are together. And in the event of a limited nuclear war half a world away, Toronto will weep. We will weep with our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, and we will weep with our children. Toronto is a success, and we can use our experience and our resources to be a much-needed voice of reason in a world of confusion. In the 1980s, City Council's declaration of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone was a source of pride. You brought the issue to each household, and you brought the issue to each Toronto voter. However, in the 1990s, it became a footnote, and in the 2000s, it was forgotten. Can we afford to be complacent on nuclear weapons at a time when diplomacy has deteriorated to posturing, insults, and threats of annihilation, while nuclear weapon states join forces to denounce the 2017 United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, at a time when nuclear superpowers continue to modernize their nuclear arsenals, improving the versatility and acceptability of nuclear weapons use while lauding their own commitments to nuclear abolition. And at a time when outdated Cold War deterrence arguments still justify the existence of nuclear weapons while ignoring the inherent and real risks of computer error, accidents, terrorism, and cyber attacks. We are living in the most dangerous of times, but also the most hopeful. I respectfully ask that the Toronto Board of Health facilitates the reaffirmation of the City of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone. Informative outreach to Torontonians with respect to the dangers of nuclear weapons. The creation of accessible, youth-oriented outreach to ensure younger generations have a reliable information source regarding nuclear weapons and their health consequences. The reaffirmation of the City of Toronto as a member for Mayors for Peace and active civic involvement in this movement, and finally a vote by City Council urging the federal government to ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your comments. Seeing no questions, we'll go on to the next deputant.
One question.
One question,
How
Councillor.
many degrees? Could you just say again that the degree change that will
1.25 degrees Celsius.
an increase?
Decrease.
Decrease.
Due to the radioactive fallout.
1.25,
It's like a mild nuclear winter.
and that will impact all of
The food production
the
and
world.
distribution, right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. So actually, the study that I'm referring to assesses the food production in China and the USA, but it would have impacts throughout the world, but the study just examines those two locations as major producers of maize and wheat and rice. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Rosemary Keenan and Sister Mary Ellen Francoeur for Pax Christi.
Thank you for the opportunity for us to speak to you today. Sister Mary Ellen is going to begin, and the research that you will be hearing is the research she has done for our group, Pax Christi Toronto.
Thank you. Pax Christi International and all of its branches have always reflected the position of the Catholic Church with regard to nuclear weapons. And I wish to just speak to that position of the Catholic Church. The Vatican as a state and the Pope as the head of the Catholic Church have been closely involved in the efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. In December 2014, at the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, Archbishop Silvano Maria Tomasi spoke on behalf of Pope Francis, declaring, "Now is the time to affirm not only the immorality of the use of nuclear weapons, but the immorality of their possession, thereby clearing the road to nuclear abolition." This statement was a huge step in Vatican policy. At the April 2016 Nonviolence and Just Peace Conference held in Rome, Pax Christi International launched a new Catholic initiative on active nonviolence and urged the Pope to bring this message of gospel nonviolence to his yearly World Day of Peace message on January 1st, 2017. The Pope did so. In that message, he pleaded for disarmament and for the prohibition and abolition of nuclear weapons. The Vatican continued to remain involved in the work leading up to the UN negotiations to create a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which came to fruition on July 7, 2017. The Vatican joined 121 other states in backing this treaty, which forbids states to develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. On September 20th, 2017, the Vatican was one of the first states to ratify the treaty. The Pope had written that the ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons is a moral and humanitarian imperative.
In Canada, the leadership of the Catholic Church, the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops, CCCB, has worked for many years in collaboration with other churches and concerned leaders to call for an elimination of nuclear weapons. A letter posted on the CCCB website in March '98 and further updated in July '06 was written to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, signed by the Most Reverend Francois Thibodeau, President of the Episcopal Commission of Social Affairs of the CCCB, along with many other Canadian church leaders. They state, the spiritual, human, and ecological holocaust of a nuclear attack can be prevented only by the abolition of nuclear weapons. It is our common duty to pursue that goal as an urgent priority. In June of 2010, the Canadian Council of Churches, of which the Catholic bishops are a member, sent a letter to then Prime Minister Harper. This letter was signed by Bishop Pierre Morissette for the Catholic Church, President of the CCCB, joining 22 other Canadian church leaders, asking the Prime Minister to endorse a vision of the world without nuclear weapons by publicly and prominently recommitting Canada to the energetic pursuit of the early elimination of all nuclear weapons. They call on the government to add a voice to those insisting that NATO end its erroneous claim that nuclear weapons are essential to preserve peace. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And that Canada mount a vigorous new effort to set out the technical and legal details for total nuclear disarmament, a world without nuclear weapons. With the Pope and the Catholic Church in the Vatican and the Canadian Catholic Church leadership, Pax Christi condemns the possession, the threat to use, the use, even if accidental, of nuclear weapons, and declares the existence of these weapons as immoral, leading to catastrophic humanitarian and environmental effects. We fully support the reaffirmation of the City of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone. Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming and for expressing your views. Next is Lynn Adamson for Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm representing the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and our organization was formed in 1960 in response to public concern over the accelerating nuclear arms race. In particular, VOW expressed the concern of mothers for the safety of their children and their future well-being. VOW participated actively in campaigns to educate the public about the dangers posed by nuclear weapons, and our members gathered baby teeth to be sent for measurement for strontium-90, one of the radioactive components released by atmospheric tests. In the decades since winning a partial test ban treaty in 1963, Voice of Women has continued our opposition to nuclear war and our commitment to building a culture of peace. And I will say in 1982, I traveled to New York to be part of nearly 1 million people marching the streets of New York, calling for a peace dividend. We wanted the money that is being wasted, trillions of dollars now, in weapons to be used for human needs and environmental needs. And that was actually the year my daughter was born. She's 35 now. And we were making some progress in the 1980s, but now we're not. Now we're falling back. However, most recently, we have been part of the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, that Satsuko was speaking about. And in December of 2017, ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Cities are ground zero for attack if and when there should ever be a nuclear exchange, as people like to politely call it. Instead, we call it annihilation. I don't know if I can put this up. Yeah. There we are. So this is a photo from Hiroshima after the atomic bombing. You can see the physical destruction of infrastructure. What you can't see is the impact of radiation, which went on to kill many tens of thousands more in addition to the 80,000 immediately killed. Now, nuclear weapons are routinely deployed around the world on a ready-to-launch basis, and each of these weapons is 1,000 times greater destructive power than this bomb dropped on Hiroshima. I am relieved to live in a city that has declared itself a nuclear weapons-free zone. By renewing our commitment, we are publicly acknowledging the dangers that nuclear weapons pose for our city. We are not hiding our heads in the sand and pretending it will go away. Now, I hope we will go one step further and advocate to our federal government that Canada sign the nuclear weapons ban treaty. This is an historic opportunity for Canada to play an extremely useful role in the world and a turning point that must come. This turning point, the commitment to the abolition of these weapons of mass destruction, must come in the very near future if we are to prevent a catastrophe of immense magnitude. And we know how sad we are about the Humboldt, the deaths that were perhaps preventable in some way. Very sad and tragic for those the team members there. But just think of the stakes of a nuclear tragedy that we must do everything we can to prevent. So Canada has not signed this treaty despite the fact that the vast majority of Torontonians support nuclear disarmament. Canada is under pressure from NATO and the USA not to sign the ban treaty. However, Canada has publicly declared that we have an independent foreign policy. On the issue of landmines, Canada played a vital leadership role in achieving a landmines ban treaty. If we are to see Canada sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, we must see sufficient pressure brought to bear on the government to act in this moment of opportunity. We must show that Canadians care. The world has changed since 1945. We have built the infrastructure of the UN and other world bodies in order to discuss and resolve global conflicts. The field of mediation and conflict resolution has been developed and expanded around the world. We know how to develop win-win resolutions. It is time to use these skills and these international bodies to resolve existing conflicts and prevent future wars, not to rely on the threat of the use of weapons of mass destruction to maintain what we call peace. Ursula Franklin, one of Voice of Women's more prominent members, said, "Peace is not the absence of war. Peace is the presence of justice and the absence of fear." It is an extremely important time to bring the commitment of the city to bear on this grave concern and to speak up for the health and future well-being of our city and our citizens. We are proud that Setsuko Thurlow, one of our members, played an instrumental role in the adoption of a nuclear test ban treaty at the UN in June last year. We rejoice with her in the acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize. Now let us stand with her to make sure that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is publicly supported by this Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lynn, can you name the treaty again? We request the Canadian government to sign the
Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other questions, we'll go on to our next speaker, who is Rob Atchison for Science for Peace. Welcome.
Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Atchison. I'm operations manager at a local packaging factory, but I also serve as co-chair of the Nuclear Weapons Working Group of Science for Peace. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. Science for Peace is a Canadian organization consisting of natural scientists, social scientists, engineers, scholars in the humanities, and people from the wider community, such as me, who seek to understand and act against the forces that make for militarism, environmental destruction, and social injustice in our world. Science for Peace was one of the groups consulted by the Toronto Board of Health for the 1982 report adopted by City Council called Public Health Consequences of Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear War. So 36 years later, we're still at it. Unfortunately, since 1982, our society has become complacent about nuclear weapons and seem to have forgotten the existential threat that they are to human civilization and to life on our planet. However, in the last 5 years, 3 international conferences on the humanitarian impact of the use of nuclear weapons were convened in Norway, Mexico, and Austria. Scientists presented new findings on the catastrophic effects of any use of nuclear weapons on humans, cities, the environment, and global climate. We will not spell them out here, but their conclusions are terrifying. We are told that nuclear weapons are necessary for our security. We hear them described in terms of tactical and strategic weapons. But in February, at the U.S. Posture Review hearings before Congress, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon, unquote. Nuclear weapons are not defensive weapons. They are heinous instruments of ultimate terror and death. They are designed to inflict mass casualties on civilians. And as we meet here today, there are thousands of nuclear weapons waiting in silos, laying in the belly of bombers circling our skies, or in Trident submarines cruising our missiles, or cruising our oceans. Their targets are the major cities of the world. The nuclear weapons of today are up to 1,000 times more powerful than those used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and even a limited exchange would cause appalling devastation. Humanitarian relief providers, including the International Red Cross, have stressed in absolute terms that in the event of a nuclear detonation, no organization would be able to provide anything close to adequate assistance. Since there is no possible response to a nuclear detonation, our only protection is to see that these weapons are eliminated and never used. The outcome of the humanitarian conferences was the negotiation and adoption of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Declaring nuclear weapons illegal under international law is an important first step to their elimination. This is the same approach that was used to work towards the elimination of biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions. Unfortunately, Canada, at the bidding of the United States, boycotted the negotiations of the treaty and now is refusing to sign or ratify it. This is not only a violation of our obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but is a reversal of Canada's historical position. The elimination of all nuclear weapons and an end to the military doctrine of nuclear deterrence is an objective that Canada has long shared with the international community. So the current government's resistance to this new treaty is very troubling. Science for Peace has written letters to the Prime Minister, to the Foreign Affairs Minister, and to every member of Parliament, asking them to reverse this decision. Organizations across the country have endorsed a call for the government to ratify the treaty. Over 1,000 members of the Order of Canada have signed a letter urging Canada's compliance. 4 former ambassadors on disarmament have publicly stated how critical it is for Canada to sign. Unfortunately, apart from a few stock responses, the government has refused to engage with us on this issue. With the federal door shut, it is vital that cities such as Toronto, the prime targets of nuclear weapons, become active in nuclear weapons abolition and peace education. Ann Johnson, chair of the 1982 Toronto Board of Health, in her introduction to the Board of Health report, stated, "The only solution to this, the ultimate of all public health threats, is to use the political process to bring about arms control, a reduction in nuclear weapons, and eventual nuclear disarmament." She went on to say that despite the enormous threat the buildup of nuclear arms poses for all life on Earth, politicians at the federal level have admitted they are unable to act without strong support from their constituents. The catastrophic impact of nuclear war on Canadian communities and the unwillingness of federal politicians to take a leadership role in this issue requires that local governments and agencies be actively involved. As the report notes, municipalities can be active in educating their residents about the consequences of a nuclear war, and through this can put pressure on federal politicians to act to reduce and eliminate the threat of a nuclear war. The reaffirmation of the City of Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone is a significant acknowledgement of the threat from these weapons, and it will help in raising public awareness of the issue. We thank you for this action. But we also recommend that this board ask Mayor Tory, as a member of Mayors for Peace, have the City of Toronto to call on the Canadian government to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The risk from nuclear weapons is too great for any of us to stay silent. Thank you for your time and for your consideration.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. Seeing no questions, Anna Chikaran. Welcome, Anna.
Sorry, I have a PowerPoint and this activating screen's gone dead.
Here to help.
Oh. Thank you. No to Nuclear Weapons has been talking to Toronto high school students about nuclear weapons for the past 8 years. There are 14,175 nuclear weapons in the world today. Nuclear weapons are a distinct class of weapon that uses the energy from nuclear fission to produce an explosive blast. Using this power source gives these weapons unique effects, which are described by Max Tegmark, a physics professor at MIT, in the following clip from Minute Physics.
Okay, Max, why should I care about nuclear weapons?
Because we've learned that they're even more dangerous than we first thought. The biggest threat from nukes isn't explosions that kill millions of people, or radioactive fallout that kills even more, or even a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse that causes mayhem by frying the electrical grid and electronics across a continent. No, the biggest threat from nuclear weapons is a global nuclear-induced winter in which the fires and smoke from as few as a few thousand nukes could darken the atmosphere enough to plunge Earth into a planet-wide mini ice age with year-round winter-like conditions. This could cause a complete collapse of the global food system and apocalyptic unrest, potentially killing most of us 7 billion people on Earth.
The effects of the blast itself will be felt immediately, but the effects of radioactive fallout will not. Many products of nuclear fission are much more radioactive than the starting material, uranium or plutonium. Most of these products will settle downwind after the blast, and we know that radioactive fallout causes cancer and birth defects. You will see these effects in this clip from the Atom Project about people exposed to fallout from a former Soviet nuclear testing site in Kazakhstan. And I should warn you that some of the images in this video are disturbing.
It has been more than 20 years since a nuclear bomb was tested here, but for the people of Semi, nuclear testing is not a thing of the past. Every day, many residents in Semi live with the legacy of those tests. For these people, the consequences of nuclear testing, the devastating effects of nuclear radiation are clear. Over the 4 decades of nuclear tests, approximately 1.5 million people in the region were affected. Today, 1 in 20 children is born with deformities. The cancer rate is 50% higher here than elsewhere in the country. Many of the population die before reaching 60.
An electromagnetic pulse is a burst of energy in the form of electromagnetic radiation. The effects of an EMP are most pronounced in high-altitude detonations, which can disrupt the electrical power grid over large areas. Toronto would not have to be the target of an EMP attack to feel its effects. We have never experienced a nuclear winter. It's a prediction, a scholarly one, that would happen if a small fraction of the world's nuclear arsenal were dropped on cities. Max Tegmark described a scenario involving a few thousand weapons, but debris lofted into the atmosphere from even 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs is predicted to cause climatic effects lasting for 10 years, during which time up to 2 billion people would starve to death.
Why should I worry about a nuclear winter when nobody in their right mind would start a nuclear war?
Unfortunately, an all-out nuclear assault isn't as unlikely as you might think, because the most likely way for a nuclear war to start isn't political, it's accidental. For example, the time faulty computer chips in US alarm systems erroneously signaled incoming Soviet missiles and the US started to prepare for full-blown retaliation, or that time when Russian satellites mistook an unusual glint of sunlight off of clouds for incoming American missiles, and an officer averted retaliation just by ignoring the alarm on gut instinct. Or the time after the Cold War ended when Russian radar systems thought a Norwegian scientific rocket was an American nuclear missile and almost launched their missiles in retaliation. You know, these close calls keep happening, and sooner or later our luck is going to run out and an entire nuclear arsenal is going to be launched accidentally.
We as a society must decide how to deal with the threat from nuclear weapons on the basis of their effects. So I thank the Board of Health for holding this hearing. I also want to thank City Council for reaffirming Toronto's 1983 designation as a nuclear weapons-free zone. It's an important symbolic gesture that could be updated and strengthened by endorsement of the 2017 United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Canada has yet to sign. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Appreciate your deputation very much. We have two more deputants that may or may not be here. I'm not sure. Zach Reuter. Oh, great. Welcome, Zach. Followed by Emma Hansen. You're here too. Great. Thank you. Thank you for waiting. Welcome, Zach.
Hi. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this meeting is taking place on stolen Indigenous land, and as such, you are the representatives of the colonizers here. The reality is that Toronto is a nuclear weapons-friendly city. The uranium processing plant at Lansdowne and DuPont has been purchased by BWXT Technologies. And BWXT Technologies is an active nuclear weapons manufacturer manufacturing U-88 plutonium grapefruit size cores for the Trident missiles in Los Alamos. But right now they are, and those are about 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. But right now they are receiving yellowcake uranium fuel powder at Lansdowne and DuPont, sintering it at 1,400 degrees centigrade, and releasing alpha radiation particles into the air and down into the sewer. In 2012, they released 2.2 kilograms of uranium into Toronto's sanitary sewer system. And when there's flooding, it kicks back up into the local environment. Women and children and people and biking right next to the plant get doused in these uranium particles, which they emit down onto the local population. The Lac-Mégantic fuel car, the cars that exploded in Lac-Mégantic rolled right past that plant. At the time, Toronto Public Health, Barbara LaChapelle and Dr. David Shapiro said there's more radiation in a banana than from that plant, but there's different types of radiation, and we're really concerned about alpha particle radiation. There is no difference between military use of nuclear power and commercial use of nuclear power. India and Pakistan were gifted CANDO technology. They were members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They used that CANDO technology to explode their test bombs and renounce their membership in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty the night before their explosions. Does the chair remember receiving this letter from the Committee for Future Generations? It was a big yellow cardstock letter.
Where do you see it from here?
Yeah, okay, well, this is a letter from the Committee for Future Generations, a group of Cree, Dene, and Métis, people who are opposing the uranium and its health effects, not only in Toronto for the local population, but also from the mining that takes place on their lands. And they write, "We stand as people united with millions across this land to call you, Canada and beyond, to hold the nuclear industry to account for knowingly putting all life on this planet at risk while continuing to create the most lethal man-made substance on Earth. We hold you and all other nuclear proponents accountable for all the deaths, disease, and misery caused by both military and non-military use of uranium you have taken from our territory." So you have an active nuclear weapons manufacturer working with 53% of all uranium used in Canada's reactors in Toronto's West End. And it's spewing uranium down the drain and into the air. And the people who are living closest in the low-income housing towers and the new condos right there, they're getting even more exposure than the rest of us. So if anything, you have some options. You can affirm Toronto as a nuclear weapons-friendly city. You can reaffirm Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone and make it completely rhetorical, like Sanctuary City and Vision Zero. Or you can actually reaffirm it as a nuclear weapons-free zone and commit to shutting down that uranium processing plant at 1025 Lansdowne in Toronto. Idle No More ran a large campaign against that plant. We blockaded that rail line and warned of an accident on that rail line. That was in 2013, before the Megantic car rule passed. And when you go there, it was in the news cycle for a little bit, but it got shut down because no one wants to go against the nuclear industry. I know people on this committee have been made aware of this issue, but they've done nothing because Toronto Public Health deferred to the nuclear regulator, and the nuclear regulator is a cheerleader for this. They're a cheerleader for the nuclear industry. They sanctioned the export of tritium, the detonating component of nuclear weapons, to Iran in 2006. So you have a responsibility to the people of Toronto to protect their health from nuclear weapons, but also the nuclear industry, which is also the nuclear weapons industry. So I'm calling on you to shut that plant down and to acknowledge it, even though there's massive censorship. And also acknowledge that uranium that's flowing through Toronto streets right now, 53% of all uranium used in Canada's reactors are trucked in through our streets to Lansdowne and DuPont. It's polluting the local environment, getting people sick, and it has to stop. And I really encourage you guys to have some questions for me because I've worked on this for years, and people still don't know. People walking by that plant with their children still don't know that the stack is right on top of them, and it's a uranium processing facility, and they're breathing that in.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Seeing none, we will say thank you. I am sure that people are getting it, councillors are getting informed as they are able. This is only one forum. Our last deputant is Emma Hansen, Department of Physics, University of Toronto, and Palani Conference on Science and Social Responsibility. Emma.
Hello. If any death occurs in the future as a result of the production, storage, testing, or military use of nuclear weapons, then actions toward nuclear disarmament could correctly be named in retrospect as a key measure that could have been taken to avert whatever catastrophe is being discussed. Nuclear disarmament is an ultimate example of a preventative approach to public health. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge that Toronto, a site of human activity, since time immemorial, is in the dish with one spoon territory. This territory, like every other, now lies in the deep shadow of the nuclear umbrella. In order to peaceably care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes, we must, among other things, face the reality of the dangers posed from outside this region and confront them accordingly. Because we live in a world in which the atom has been split, the responsibility to move toward nuclear disarmament is a collective responsibility that befalls us all and which must be discharged to whatever extent possible in both our personal and our professional spheres. Accordingly, I'd like to outline a few steps that can be taken in that direction within Toronto's municipal health landscape. Toronto professes to be a nuclear weapons-free zone. My friend asked me yesterday if there were a danger of that not being the case. He meant to ask, I think, whether there's a danger of intact nuclear warheads arriving in our midst. Inshallah, the existing warheads do remain intact, but unfortunately, in practice, nuclear weapons are a radical, terrible equalizer. Geographical space and distance in particular means less than it did before 1945. Boundaries cannot be enforced against nuclear catastrophe. The destruction is indiscriminate. That being the case, existential threat is not on our radar, except largely for the demands placed on us by our own material constraints, as the other important theme of this meeting, deaths due to poverty and lack of shelter, illustrates. We live at Victoria Park or along the Bathurst bus line, not in the realm of international diplomacy. But in the event of an adverse nuclear event anywhere in the world, Toronto would shudder. Our community is diverse and has roots spanning the globe. So in order to work toward health with the breadth required by our modern situation, professional and governmental bodies concerned with health, both human and environmental, ought to apply pressure wherever possible to move toward a security climate that is not predicated on the specter of mass annihilation. To adopt the title of a nuclear weapons-free zone does little. To remain a nuclear weapons-free zone in more than name is to have the people of Toronto on board actively demanding a world without nuclear warheads. Thinking about the federal political landscape, one problem is that NATO's doctrine of deterrence is a required catechism for club members and hence would require more diplomatic capital to negotiate around than Canada currently possesses. A level of political consensus will need to be reached regarding the irrationality of the security apparatus we depend on. This consensus has been achieved in other places, and the federal level need not come first. In the past several years, countries such as Norway, Austria, and Mexico have taken firm stances toward nuclear disarmament, with cities hosting large public gatherings alongside the government's participation in UN affairs. Under the banner of the movement to preempt the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, many actors have raised a chorus for their abolition. Toronto can do the same. It is the steady, widespread grassroots pressure that will eventually secure a world without nuclear weapons and the cataclysmic threat to human and environmental life that they pose. That is, if we make it in time. That's where we come in. In the City of Toronto, action could take a few forms. The city's educational, artistic, and cultural spaces are vibrant. Could you, as a board, recommend that the library host a speaker series about existential threats? Eric Schlosser's Command and Control is but one recent popular book that outlines the precarity of life under the nuclear umbrella. Could secondary civics or health education stand to be updated for the nuclear age? Could the Board of Health be the instigator? I would also like to propose that the Board of Health devote some of its advocacy resources to persuading political affiliates to recognize the urgency of the task. Specifically, please pressure City Council to vote to urge the federal government to sign and ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and to align itself publicly with the humanitarian impact movement. Dismantling the global nuclear apparatus is an enormous task, but it's one for which the work is shared among many actors at many levels, including us. In summary, if nuclear disarmament does not seem to be among the key priorities of municipal health governance, that is only because we have lost sight of the incomprehensibly grave nature of the threat. Going forward, I urge you to consider how, on behalf of the city's people, nuclear disarmament may continue to find its way onto your agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Seeing no questions, are there any other deputants that I'm not aware of? I want to thank everyone for your presentations. Now we have some questions of staff. Any questions of staff? Councillor Layton.
Thank you very much to our Medical Officer of Health. There was an issue raised of a more immediate health concern and public health concern by one of the deputants around exposure related to the uranium refinery on DuPont. I remember when this issue came up originally, and I don't remember it didn't start as an illness-related thing, and I'm wondering if we have any information about clustering of exposure-related illnesses as a result of this. Because this is, I at least don't have a firm understanding of the level of emergency we're in right now.
So through the chair, thank you for the question. I admit I'm not familiar with the file as it came from the past, but happy to look into it. I don't know if any of my colleagues here would be familiar, or those who were here prior to my arrival. They may have some more insight with respect to the issue.
Got someone wanting to jump in.
I'm not sure how much I want to jump in. It was an issue at the time that we did investigate. I don't have all the details firmly in my memory, but I do know that we worked with the Ministry of Environment to sample the surrounding area for uranium in the soil, and I don't think we found anything that would have caused us concern. We could report back in more detail, though, and precisely what we did and how we investigated the situation.
We would have tested the soil, would we have tested air, or would have the particulate matter just ended up on the soil anyhow?
There's the facility itself is required to monitor the air and their emissions, and so that data would have been available to us as well that we would have looked at. If you actually go to the site, you can see the equipment that they use to monitor the air at the perimeter of the facility.
Thank you. And just because we we do have the powers to close down businesses that we license, restaurants, for example, if they're a public health concern. A facility like this, do we have any jurisdiction to shut their doors?
So through the chair, we do have some legislative powers under the Health Protection and Promotion Act to act within the context of a health hazard and to seek certain remedial or particular actions to reduce or limit the hazards that might be posed through a particular source. Clearly, there would have to be a health hazard, something that fits within the context of the legislation, and then we would have to pursue from there. But again, the establishment of the health hazard is first and foremost.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Doucette, questions?
It's a bit of a follow-up to your answer. You mentioned that there's actually equipment testing the air ongoing. Is that correct? Is that what I heard?
Yes.
And who sees those results?
So I can't remember, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Authority that regulates them would have them. Or as I recall, they also publish something publicly as well with some of that information.
So someone else is looking at the results, not just the owners of the business, for instance?
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to speakers. I do have a motion that pulls it together, but do you want to start? Okay, Councillor Cressy. Speakers.
Just very briefly, and to build on some of what we heard from the deputants, is that there is clearly no greater calling and no more important work than that of the work for peace. And to the deputants, many of whom have been here for hours, and many of whom have been working on the issue of nuclear disarmament for not just years but decades, I just want to thank you. Many of whom I sat on the board of the Canadian Peace Alliance with when I began my work. It was mentioned that nuclear disarmament has fell off the radar in recent decades, but I think it's probably fair to say that it is now more important than ever as we look just south of the border and we turn on Twitter. And it's for those reasons that I think the motion here in front of us to reaffirm our position is part of a global response, starting at local levels that has to be louder and louder because the risks are very real, as we've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cressy. I'll speak next, seeing that there's no other speakers. You need 90 seconds? Okay, so I'll put this on. Okay, great, okay. Unaccustomed as I am to using 5 minutes. So I do have a motion. You may be aware, folks, that City Council has actually already expressed its support for the City of Toronto's reaffirmation of its position as a nuclear weapons-free zone. It did that at the last council meeting and then referred the matter to us at the Board of Health. So the first motion would be for this board to reaffirm its support for establishing Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone. It is absolutely true that in the early 80s there was a big flurry of activity, and out of that process, Canada, because it went Canada-wide, it went global. We got a position, the Canadian ambassador for disarmament. We did the Peace Gardens, which is out here. There was just an international wave of support as the United States and the then Soviet Union seemed to be heading for a collision course. I was actually involved in that movement, and that's where I do remember, if I could go down memory lane a little bit, meeting for the first time, me with my son in a stroller, meeting a Councillor Layton with his son in his stroller at various rallies and gatherings on that very issue. So I know the folks in this room have been, some of them have been active not for 10 years, 20 years, but frankly for their lifetime. The nuclear crisis was averted. The doomsday clock at that time went something like 2 minutes to midnight. It was that close. And then it, frankly, with the changes with Ronald Reagan and the demise of the Soviet Union, the clock was pushed back. And I think, as Councillor Cressy mentioned, these days war and rumors of war are on the increase, and it is appropriate for us as public health officials whose primary obligation is to defend life and to promote health, to be conscious of that and to let other orders of government know of our position and to do what we can. And what we can do is express our support and also encourage our national government to sign the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that's what this motion does. What this does, my hope, as has happened in the past, other cities look at this and have similar kinds of debates and conversations. It's then taken to faith communities. It's taken to union halls. It becomes part of building a movement that allows for us to governing councils at universities as well, professional organizations. It allows for a movement to take place to give clear voice to our national leaders that there is a different way than armed conflict, nuclear armed conflict especially, to resolve human disagreements. And that's what this Board of Health, for the sake of our health, is making the case for. So that's why I present these motions and hope for your support. Is that enough, Councillor Layton?
Yes, well, I'm going to buy about 2 more minutes to let the fastest finger here in the room type up this motion that that one of our colleagues will move in a minute.
Do you want to speak to it though?
I'm going to speak to it, okay. Just very briefly. There's not much more that keeps me up at night in a worse way than the fear of this kind of global annihilation. It's pretty much right up with climate change on my nightmares of what's to come. This is one, I hate to say this and sound defeatist, this is one that I think we're more likely to be able to do something about in my lifetime. Unfortunately, I think I'm now leaning towards David Suzuki's call on climate change that we've gone so far down a path, it will take several generations for us to fix the damage that we continue to do. But I think some of what we heard today are just those powerful stories about why we need to do that change. And when this came up originally at council, this was something that I know in my dad's life he was quite proud of being a part of, and I wanted to, in his memory, go find out more about it. So I went down. At first, I searched online. There was nothing related to the original passage of this motion. I then went to. There's a room in the councilors' area of the second floor that has the old minutes of city council meetings, and they're all in these old giant bound binders. They're in something called the library. It's a very small meeting room that we only ever use when we have overflow. Because to be frank, kind of smells a little bit, and it's not a comfortable room to be in because of these papers. And normally they're just donated by one councillor when he or she leaves. So I started leafing through, and I found 1983, and then I had to go back and find the motion itself. I was saddened to learn that the former councillor Layton wasn't as involved in putting it on the agenda. But what left me actually laughing was a motion put forward by a colleague, KK, he was lovingly known as, that asked, it was an amendment to the original motion that asked, quote, His Worship Mayor of Toronto go and try to negotiate a non-proliferation agreement with the to Moscow and to China to negotiate non-proliferation agreements with all of those individuals. That was probably ice, to warn people, ice sliding off the flying saucer of our council chamber hitting the roof. That's probably what it was, I'm guessing. So I had a good laugh about that and printed it up and handed it to some people that probably would have been around at the same time, including our clerk's office, because I'm sure they would have liked to get, they would have had a fun laugh out of that. This issue with the Lansdowne industrial facility, I remember when it came up originally, and I live in the neighborhood not far away, and it was a concern. I remember that the Board of Health at the time examined it, or the department did, But I'm not sure where it went, and I'm certainly curious about if there is contamination getting out in the local community. I, for one, want to know because I live in the local community, but I think there's a lot of people that live in that neighborhood that would like to know. So my understanding is there's a motion coming in a couple seconds on getting an update on what is coming out of that facility.
Great, thank you. Can you put that motion on? Are there any other speakers here on this item?
I think Stacy was going to.
Yeah, we have one addition.
Great, thank you. Can we take them all as a package? My motion and Stacey Berry's motion? Stacey, do you want to speak to your motion? You can't, okay. You can, but maybe
you should. Maybe you should.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read it in comments. Yeah. So one of the things that we found curious, based on what the deputant raised, is are there potential health hazards? It's worth looking into at least. So the motion reads as follows: that the medical officer of health report back to the Board of Health to provide an update on emissions to see if there are any potential health hazards from the facility at 1025 Lansdowne in Toronto.
Okay, thank you. Should we separate them out? All in favor? No? As a package? Yeah? All in favor? Recorded vote? Yes, okay. All in favor? Paul Nagpal, Joe Cressy, Councillor Mahevik, Councillor Doucette, Angela Johnson, Trustee Chris Glover, Councillor Paul Fletcher, Councillor Mike Layton, Ashna Bowery, and Stacey Berry. Dr. Ashna Bowery and Stacey Berry. That's unanimous. Thank you very much, everyone, for your presentations and for coming out and for the good work that you do. Okay, our next item is a death of people experiencing homelessness, 2017 review. We'll just give folks a minute or two to leave. Great. Okay, I think we can proceed. Okay, so this is number 2, 26.2, Deaths of People Experiencing Homelessness, 2017 review. I'll pass it over to Dr. Davila.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. As you'll see in front of you, members of the Board of Health, we're joined today by some of our very important members at Toronto Public Health. We do have, as you can well imagine, it takes an entire team to undertake these initiatives, and the reporting on deaths of people experiencing homelessness in the City of Toronto was one such new initiative that was commenced by Toronto Public Health just last year, January 2017. So with us today are some of the folks from our Surveillance and Epidemiology Unit at Toronto Public Health, and they're going to take you through a presentation to accompany the report that's in front of you.
I'm Deborah Williams. I'm the Director of Performance and Standards with Toronto Public Health, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sarah Collier, the Supervisor of Surveillance and Epidemiology, Liz Corson, Dr. Joyce Bernstein, and over to my right, Associate Director Paul Fleischer. They're going to be walking you through the important work that they did with over 200 agencies and organizations to bring you this report on the tracking of deaths of those experiencing homelessness in Toronto.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Collier. As Deborah mentioned, I am the supervisor of the Surveillance and Epidemiology Unit at Toronto Public Health. I'm here to present on the monitoring system that we established for deaths of people experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to present some of the details of the development of the system, an overview of the data cleaning and analysis that took place, a brief overview of some of the results, and some of the next steps that Toronto Public Health will be taking based on these results. So developing a system. Prior to 2017, capturing the deaths of people experiencing homelessness was limited to registered city-run shelter residents. To provide a more accurate picture of the problem, TPH developed a system to collect data more widely. One of the issues complicating data collection on people experiencing homelessness in the past has been a lack of a standard definition of homelessness. The definition was established by the Canadian Observatory of Homelessness in 2012, and this was the most familiar and widely used to those consulted and thus adapted. The selection of the data to be collected was based on a balance between the desire to capture the most useful information versus minimizing the burden placed on Sentinel reporters. Since the system relies heavily on Sentinel reporting on a volunteer basis, considerable consultation took place with our partnering agencies. In the end, data collected include demographics, health issues, housing history, and cause of death. When dealing with personal health information, it is imperative to establish a secure method of collecting, storing, and analyzing the data. TPH worked closely with our privacy officer to ensure that the variables collected were appropriate and that the data collection tool met our rigorous privacy requirements. An example of protecting privacy that occurred during discussions with the supporting community agencies was the decision whether or not to include the person's name. From a data systems perspective, including a name is important for a number of reasons, including detecting a duplicate. But 2 points of view were expressed on including names in the data collection. A majority felt that homeless individuals should be acknowledged in death, given that many of them have lived their lives in the shadows. However, others felt that anonymity should be respected in death. In the end, the decision was made to include a field for name with an understanding that some agencies may not fill it out and name would be unknown. Moving on to data analysis, over 200 agencies participated in the collection of data. The agencies and programs recruited to be Sentinel reporters included city-run shelters, drop-in centers, community health centers, community resource centers, food banks, meal programs, child welfare organizations, parent resource centers, employment and training centers, and religious organizations which provide temporary shelter for homeless individuals. With the breadth of community agencies involved, there was an increased chance of a death being captured. but also an increased chance for duplication. A key component to data monitoring analysis is ensuring that duplicates are detected and removed. This happens through internal processes as well as following up with individual reporters. The information for each new case was sent to the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario, the OCCO, where any coroner's cases are checked for completeness and accuracy, then returned to Toronto Public Health. Coroner's cases include those that are deemed sudden and unexpected. In 2017, 56 cases fit this description. Any additional or corrected information received from the coroner on these 56 cases, such as official cause of death, was added to the database. Missing information or unknown responses are a limitation and should be considered when interpreting some of the results. The unknown category reflects to some degree the hidden nature of the lives of these individuals, unknown in many cases, even to those who report their death. The collaborative and diligent work done to set up, run, and analyze this data brings us to the results provided in the report. Just to highlight, in 2017, the deaths of 100 people experiencing homelessness were reported to Toronto Public Health. This translates to an average of 1.9 deaths per week. Males accounted for the vast majority of deaths at 74 cases, and this aligns with the general population of people experiencing homelessness being predominantly male. The median age of death was 48 years old. This means that half of these individuals were younger than 48 when they passed away. This is much younger than the life expectancy for the general Toronto population, which is 81 years for males and 85 for females. In terms of location, most of the deaths occurred indoors, often in a hospital or a shelter in the downtown area. 9 deaths occurred outdoors, and the location of death was unknown for 26 cases. The top 3 causes of death reported were drug overdose, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. The cause of death was unknown for 28 cases, and at this time, 3 cases are pending further investigation. So what are the next steps? Based on the results of this report, it is clear that other sources of data are needed to provide an accurate picture of the deaths of people experiencing homelessness and their lived experience in the city. For example, anecdotal information related to the deceased's history of homelessness was not provided or unknown for 45 cases, which is almost half. Where provided, comments were primarily limited to past or current use of shelters. This highlights the need to continue to work in new and innovative ways with other areas of the city, such as shelter support and housing administration, to determine additional information on people experiencing homelessness. To ensure that the monitoring system is comprehensive, Toronto Public Health will work with the Toronto Area LHINs on the feasibility of hospitals sharing information. We also will continue to work with our community partners whose participation in the reporting is truly the only way that this monitoring system can be successful. The data monitoring system we have in place will continue to collect information from Sentinel agencies. Toronto Public Health will continue to monitor and validate this data. We will be publicly reporting on the city's website every 6 months. However, should we notice any significant changes in the data, we will increase reporting. Toronto Public Health is dedicated to exploring how to fill our data gaps through additional sources of data. We recognize the need for comprehensive information to develop strong evidence that can support TPH action strategy for addressing this issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Before we get into questions, I'm going to ask for deputations first. So let's do deputations and then bring staff back for any questions. I actually saw Greg Cook leave. Are there any deputations? Any deputations? Okay, okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, then come on back. Sorry, staff. Sorry, folks. You look grand there, by the way. Are there questions of staff? Okay, we'll just go around the table. Councillor Fletcher to start.
I just did quick math and see that of the deaths, 40% were related to overdose. 27 out of 74, approximately 40%. Is that right?
So it's out of 100.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. There's a category called other that's not included in
That,
that one.
but of the ones we know about and that you're able to say, these are the deaths we were able to
I
track.
see.
That was 74.
Removing the unknown.
Pardon me?
Removing the unknown.
Yes, because we don't know. So of that, 74, about 40% were drug overdose deaths. Were those indoor deaths, outdoor deaths? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, we know that 9 of the deaths occurred outdoors. We don't have the information by each cause of death, which occurred indoors and which occurred outdoors, but the chances are that very few of the drug overdoses occurred outdoors, if any at all.
Okay.
I'd like to make one more comment there regarding the 40% that you mentioned. One thing about drug overdoses is that those deaths were far more likely to go to the coroner's office and therefore have a confirmed cause of death than some of the other causes. So it's likely that those other categories were what you could maybe term more natural causes of death that weren't investigated by the coroner.
So these are, it's between 25 and 40% then.
That's
and
accurate.
The areas of the city in which these deaths occurred, do you have a geographic area that you would let us know?
We're not reporting by geographic area because of confidentiality concerns. So although we do have that information for some of the deaths, it's not something that we've decided we can report out on publicly.
Yeah, I don't mean streets or anything. I mean basically Toronto and East York Community Council area. Would you agree with me that majority of those deaths would have taken place in Toronto and East York Community Council area?
We would have to check the numbers to be sure, but I would say yes.
More than likely.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Okay, just going around the circle. Councillor Doucette.
Thank you very much. I was very surprised to see cancer in there. I think that's the first time I've sort of thought about people, homeless people having cancer. Is there any way to find out if any of those people were receiving treatment or had treatment, or was it because they were homeless, maybe they didn't know they had cancer and didn't get treatment? That's a lot to throw at you, I'm sorry. Do you have any more information about the people who died from cancer, I guess?
Not at this current time. So one of the future directions for the system is to work more closely with hospitals who may have deaths to people experiencing homelessness in their institutions. As a part of the conversations regarding data sharing, we can investigate if it's possible to determine some of those things, but at this time, all of the information we have is coming from the person who's reporting their death, who's often a community service provider as opposed to a health professional, so we don't have that information right now.
I mean, I'm assuming that one of the reasons we are doing this report is because we want to see, as a city, where we can improve so we don't have 100 deaths under the title of homelessness. So I'm assuming that's why we're trying to drill down into finding out where we can improve.
Absolutely. So through the chair, that is exactly the reason why we wanted to undertake this data collection initiative. It wasn't just an exercise in respect of data. It was an exercise in informing ourselves and providing appropriate information to other agencies and partners so as to actually change, direct action so that we can improve in this regard. When it comes to new data collection initiatives, however, what's interesting is that, there is always the hope that that new data collection initiative will derive very specific answers and provide very specific direction in the first instance. But often what happens when you're starting with a new data collecting initiative is that you do have some answers, you get better clarity with respect to the situation, but you also, in fact, find more questions that you need to develop further and to explore further so as to more specifically direct action. And I think that's what we've seen here. We do have more information than we've ever had in the past. And I think it's interesting as we've explored this issue, and as I've done more reading around which other jurisdictions, so I believe this is really one of the very few that exists in the country. It's the only one in Ontario that we're aware of, this kind of data collecting initiative. And having looked at some reports from the United States, it seems that they have very few data collection initiatives of this type as well. So I think that we are actually we've found out information that we did not previously have, but I think we also recognize that there is much more that we would like to know, and we're continuing to work with partners. And my understanding is that in respect of the issue on data collection with hospitals, we're actively advancing that conversation, and I expect we should be able to, have more information as we proceed further with this initiative.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm just. We've had discussions here before about homelessness, and I'm trying to think of what the report was. But when we had that discussion before, we talked about the state of Utah, which decided to end homelessness, and they did it not, partly out of compassion, and I'd like to think that's the first motivation for people. Well, they did it because economically it made sense. It just costs a lot of money to keep people on the streets, to provide services, and so is there any sense of costing of this that would help us make an argument, to just end homelessness, like provide homes for people? Through Mr. Chair.
So through the chair, I don't know that we have those data here for you today, but I do know that there are many other jurisdictions that are actively looking at this question. And while I admit I'm not familiar with that which was done at the state of Utah, I am familiar with what is happening in other jurisdictions. I think most notably, Finland has undertaken very specific initiatives around homelessness. A Housing First initiative that was done with significant support from their national government. So I think there are indeed models out there. There have been reports through the European Union around that which works and the cost associated with it. I don't know that we have very specific stats here. My colleagues from Shelter Support and Housing Administration may have some information around the cost of shelters, but I don't know that we actually have a comprehensive tally available for you today. It's quite costly, though, I would imagine.
Right. So I think this is a great step, and it does give us some more data to start tackling this issue. Is it possible for this to be moving in that direction where we can actually do a cost-benefit analysis and we can provide a case to the city that says, you will save X amount of dollars if you end homelessness and just provide homes rather than trying to keep people on the streets?
So through the chair, I'm sure that there would be great value in doing that. I don't know that we would be the only partners or the only agency involved in that undertaking, but certainly we're happy to contribute, and we are working with other city divisions, other community agencies, partners at the provincial level, and where possible at the federal level to try to come up with better solutions to the current situation that we face today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I have some questions, and as I read this report a few days ago, my question is usually when you collect data, it feeds into an analysis that feeds into an action. And so what I'm wondering, and we don't want to collect data for the sake of data, and I'm going to be a bit of a provocateur here. So when you collect all this data, what does this tell us is the action that needs to take place to assist in homelessness prevention or bringing people into homes from homelessness? What does this do, this data?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'll let my staff add on if they would like to, but I do think that these data tell us first and foremost that we have, one, a situation that absolutely needs to be addressed, two, that it's a situation that will actually require the concerted efforts of a number of different parties, not just your public health department, although we're very happy to participate in the efforts to address this very serious situation. I think the most tangible thing that I can speak to at this point, however, is that there is a need to create systems, to work with partners who actually have interaction on a very personal and individual basis with those who experience homelessness in our city, to actually understand what the circumstances are, right? This was an initiative around monitoring deaths. I think that by bringing it to the surface, it actually gives us the purview to speak more specifically with our partners, whether they be at SSHA, whether they be through community agencies, to find out how do we actually better collect what we know about each and every one of these individuals who have interaction with our, whether it's SSHA, whether it's community agencies. What can we actually find out about the circumstances of these individuals and how we can actually then engage in very preventive activities and also deal with and provide services to help them move beyond the homelessness that they experience now.
Okay, just to give it a second round, if we were collecting data and information, sorry, I was asking questions, and then I'll go over to you. No, second round for me, second set of questions, still within my 5 minutes. Thank you. If we were collecting, say, data and statistics on the cost, just following Trustee Glover, and let's say we found out that it cost in the last year of these 100 people's lives, 100,000. There actually is an article, several articles on $1 Million Murray in the United States. So let's say we found out that it cost $200,000 to get this person in and out of emergency services and all the health care that needed to be provided. That data I could use. We could use that as a city to say to the provincial minister of health and then the minister of Community and Social Services, hey, if you transfer a little bit of money over here, you're going to save a lot of money over here, and it leads to an action. I guess my question, I see Gord Tanner here, does this data, has it in the last year changed any service level, outcome, way of thinking?
So thanks for the question, and through the chair, what I'd say is with respect to the opiate crisis and the deaths we're seeing related to the use of opiates, certainly we've been working with public health to implement more harm reduction programming and availability of naloxone in our community partners' shelter sites as well as our own. So that would be a tangible outcome of our work related to this work. Certainly, our division and council has approved our housing first approach to try to get people out of shelters and into housing with supports that they need to be successful. And we're focused and wanting to continue to take on that challenge. The housing market and affordability issues are probably the greatest challenge we have with respect to implementing that.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Cressy, questions?
Just a couple questions. So first of all, and I noticed in the report, and we talked about it in previous updates, this report of the 100 deaths, it illustrates the health risks and the data that we've collected for 2017, but it's by no means exhaustive. In actual fact, the number is likely much higher. Is that right?
It's likely higher, yes.
And it's likely higher because what data are we not accessing?
Yeah, there's always going to be deaths of people experiencing homelessness that go unreported, but even though that's the case, we do have opportunities to improve our system, and one of those opportunities, which, as Dr. Davila mentioned, is currently underway, is working a little more closely with the hospitals. We have some privacy and confidentiality concerns with them sharing data with us, but once we can also access information on deaths to people experiencing homelessness within hospitals, other than what is reported to us via our community agencies who know of deaths occurring in hospitals, we'll have a more comprehensive picture.
Okay, so I'll come back to the question on hospitals in a moment. Just on the topic of 27% of all the known deaths being derived from overdoses, or 40% of the ones for which we have a cause. It's my understanding, and perhaps this is to our medical officer of health, that at the May meeting, of the Board of Health is when we will be getting a substantive update on the state of the overdose action plan and the expanded efforts currently being undertaken?
Yes, through the chair, we will be providing an update on the overdose action plan at the May meeting.
Okay. And one of the questions that Councillor Fletcher had related to the geographical location specifically of overdose deaths. My understanding is that we currently have the full breakdown of by neighborhood where the overdose deaths in the city have taken place. Every single death, which intersection and where, that of the deaths we're aware of. Will that be provided at the May meeting as well?
We will be providing a high-level overview, but as you know, there are some concerns around providing very specific locations in order to protect the confidentiality of those to whom the information belongs.
So, but I'm not referring to identifying specific individuals, but rather will we receive at the May meeting the geographical breakdown? We received this at the Toronto Drug Strategy Implementation Panel. So my assumption here is that the Board of Health will receive the same geographical breakdown that we received at the Toronto Drug Strategy Panel.
Yes, through the chair, excuse me. I thought you were looking for more specific individualized data, but the information that you would have received at the Drug Strategy Implementation Panel is exactly that which will be presented here.
I just, as a side note for this board, I think we'll find it very illuminating because it breaks down geographically where overdoses are happening. I guess the next round of questions then related to the hospital. So I recognize the recommendation for us to work with the LHIN to try to get around the privacy considerations to the point that hospitals will share information with us. I guess my question, and I'll direct it to anybody, is can we not mandate the hospitals to share this information with us? Such as, are hospitals not mandated to share information related to gunshot wounds, syphilis, dog bites? Like, can we not mandate this?
So, through the chair, under the existing legislation, we have the authority to collect those data, but we do not have the authority to require them. Now, that being said, we don't have the authority to require that the hospitals do not have the obligation to actually provide that to us. We do have the authority to collect the data. So we have there is the right for us to actually collect those very data that you're speaking of. However, my sense is that the conversation that's happening right now, and our staff can actually address that in a more specific way, we are actually having we're making progress with the talks with the hospital, and I expect that we should be able to have those data from our hospital partners on the go-forward basis.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that. Then I guess with the time I have left, and this may be to Toronto Public Health, it may be to Gord Tanner, I see from Shelter Support and Housing Administration. How do we, beyond tracking data from hospitals, how do we ensure that we are tracking, that we are providing the support for people who are homeless, who might be in a shelter one night, a hospital the next night, a respite the next night? How are we ensuring that we're not tracking deaths, but rather tracking clients to provide that wraparound support? And I don't know who wants to jump in, if that's Gord, because to me that's more important than tracking the data of the location of deaths, but rather tracking the client's pattern so that we can support them.
So I can jump in if you like. So through the chair, certainly this is a gap currently with respect to the work we do with people who come into contact with any one of our shelters, street outreach programs, et cetera. We have a database that tracks interactions, admissions to a shelter, and length of stay, discharge. But to couple that with person's interaction with the healthcare system, we haven't made that leap at this point. We are having discussions, certainly with the Toronto Central LHIN, our partners at Toronto Public Health, specifically about that information and how we could move ahead with capturing and coupling that information while we overcome privacy implications and other things like that.
So if I might add to that answer, as you know, the Toronto Central LHIN has also indicated that they're willing to provide, and they have every intention of providing, specific healthcare services within the context of shelters. And I think, so that creates the opportunity for those links that Gord just spoke of, to deepen those links between the LHIN, between the shelter system, Toronto Public Health, and other healthcare providing agencies throughout the city. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that, you know, we do have, as you can see, some clear data expertise at Toronto Public Health, and I'm sure that there is some expertise as well at SSHA. And I think that there is a commitment, and I've seen it already, and it will continue to happen, for us to collaborate more actively together on how we can actually better serve clients and meet their needs, rather than counting them, as you suggest, Councillor Cressy, after the fact.
Great, thank you very much. Seeing no other questioners to speak. Councillor Cressy, Councillor Doucette. Councillor Cressy to start.
Sure. Well, let me begin and thank you to the 4 staff who are here from Toronto Public Health and our MOH under her leadership. And I'm sure to the many who've worked with you that this is not an easy task, both in terms of the coordination that is required across 200 agencies, across our Shelter Support and Housing Administration Division, and in cooperation with the province and the LHIN. And so I want to thank our staff for that work. Not only is it not easy work, it is emotionally draining work when you are considering that you are tracking the deaths of people who need not die. And so I want to thank our staff for that. I should also acknowledge that as we talk about homeless deaths in our city, that activists in our city have been tracking these deaths for 20 years. That the Homeless Memorial Project that has identified more than 1,000 names and Jane and John Does over 20 years and meets monthly has been doing this on their own. And they were doing this on their own because we as a city did not do it. In fact, this initiative, which has been implemented with extraordinary competence and compassion by our staff, was instigated at the direction of Council when Councillor Ainsley and myself directed staff to do this. And so I think it's important for us to always push the envelope on measures like this when it's Council's direction too. The reason we track causes of deaths is to prevent unnecessary deaths. And so coming out of this, what really struck me was the percentage of overdose deaths that were part of this. That was a real startling figure, and I think at our May 7th meeting, where we're getting a full briefing on the state of the overdose action plan, given the escalation of preventable deaths, we once again as a Board of Health will need to be ready next month to push the envelope. The other piece that really struck me, and I think it's a strong recommendation, and I thank staff for it, and I'm pleased to hear that we may hear some good news from the LHIN and the hospital soon, is that they're currently, due to privacy concerns, I'm sure, but also complexity issues, which is what we need to punch through, related to data sharing with the hospitals. But I would come back to, and it was a gap that Gord Tanner, one of our superstars in shelter supported housing, just acknowledged, is that we need to do more than collect data from the hospitals. We need to ensure that individuals who are living rough on the streets and using our shelters and our respites and our 24-hour drop-ins, and yes, using health services through the provincial side, that we need to ensure that those individuals, that we are providing a system of care whereby they are tracked so that we can provide the supports they need on a day-to-day basis. And that, to me, is the bigger hurdle and the critical hurdle alongside collecting the data, because we collect the data to respond, but this is an instance where we know we need to fill a gap. And so with that, I'll simply close by once again thanking the staff and the activists for not only the work, but the emotional toll it must take on them. And to say, as I've said every time, that we deal with this issue. And the first year in which we've reported on it, that in this city in 2017, to have 100 deaths is a failure and a blight on all of us. So let's stop them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cressy. Councillor Doucette.
Thank you very much. Yes, I too want to thank staff. I thought we'd have more deputants today, and I was gearing up for some of the stories, the true stories we hear around this table sometimes. I'm going to look a little on the brighter side. First of all, I was asking about the number of people who we found had cancer. If they were having treatment, that's great. If they weren't having treatment, was it because they were homeless and we didn't get them treatment? So how can we deal with that? I know that we are already improving our shelters. I know that for a fact because I went through a whole process I'm going to call it, last year when we approved a new 24-hour-a-day men's homeless shelter. It will be somewhere where I believe men who are living on our street will actually agree and want to go to. That, I think, is very important. That will get a lot of homeless people off of our streets. Something simple as having this men's shelter pet-friendly. We have, I understand, a lot of young people who have pets, and they live on the street. And they won't go into a shelter because there's not many shelters that can take them and their pet. And they won't leave their pet behind. So I think it sounds a small thing, but I think it's a big thing. And as I say, improving how we do our shelters, improving the accommodation we are providing people while we help them, whether it's just to get ID, so they can actually get some funds, whether they can use that to apply for a job, to give them that leg up they need at that point in their lives. We've opened up safe injection sites. I think that is a major thing. I know some residents would love us to do more, but I think we've got to open the ones we've got approved, open the ones we have the funding for, and move that forward, and then see where we're going. Open Doors, there's a program where property owners can apply for funds to have affordable homes, and in my ward we're looking at possibly a new to be built 26 units for people who are living with mental health issues. Those people would never go into a shelter. They just wouldn't, because they can't. So we need to have places for them where they have a room and hopefully a private bathroom and a door they can call their front door, even if it's in a building which maybe has another 40 units. It's their space. We need to be pushing that. We added to our budget for 2018 some Parks Ambassador people. Instead of having one full-time person and 2 or 3 part-time seasonal people, we're now going to have 3 teams which can be around our city. That's important because they build these connections with people who are living in our parks to encourage them to come in out of our parks, to live with a roof over their heads, a front door again. We are also pushing, I know, through City Council to have developers build more affordable homes. That, I think, is our end goal. Shelters are a temporary step, but the affordable housing and these other units to provide people with permanent accommodation is our goal. And I believe that the numbers we are getting will show us why people won't come in off the streets, how we can help. Do we need to make sure that as many homeless people as possible have a complete head-to-toe checkup with a doctor? Would that help them live full lives if they have some mental or medical issues? So thank you for this. It's only 1 year, I know, but I think as we go into the next year, I think we will learn more. And I am interested to know what areas these people were living and died in, because I think that will also help us know where we've got to put our funds and where we've got to put our ideas to get people off the street and to give them a full life. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll just add a few comments. Well, in measuring the number of deaths of people experiencing homelessness, we're really talking about the metrics of homelessness. And as I said in my questioning, to me, metrics are helpful when they're part of an analysis that leads to a strategy that leads to an action. And really, at some point, it would be good for us as a health unit and working with shelter housing support and administration to say, well, what kind of metrics are helpful here? Deaths are good. They helped us to understand better the link between opioid use and people and homelessness. I think healthcare cost and what kind of services people need when they are on the street, mental health, drug-related, those kind of metrics seem to me help us to paint a picture that allow for a better service response. So at some point, it would be good to have a conversation, I'm not moving any motion, on the metrics of homelessness, and so that we're not counting for counting's sake, but we're counting with the idea that getting a better picture helps us to target resources in the right direction. I think that there is enough knowledge out there for us to now say very confidently to the provincial government and to the Linzes, you need to be part of this scene. We need health care professionals to be present much more deeply with our shelters, with our respite centers, drop-in centers, and so on. And there may be specific kinds of health care professionals that we need. And as we refine the data collection, using a variety of signposts, I think that'll help us to determine what kind of supports people need to get from homelessness into housing. But that's for, I'm not going to move a motion on that. It's just a comment that I want to put out there. Any other final word? Okay, seeing none, there are recommendations before us. I think, Councillor Cressy, you moved them? Yep. Do you want to put them on the board, or it's in your packages? Okay, all in favor, opposed if any, that's carried. 2 more items that can be pretty quick, folks. Thank you very much. One is, you have before you a note from the Ontario Minister of Health and Long-Term Care. You want to just 30 seconds, Dr. Davila?
Sorry, we're on.
We're on 26.4.
Okay. So, yes, in respect of, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In respect of communications that was received from the Minister of Health, so Friday the 13th isn't usually known as a lucky day, I think, in most cultures. However, it would appear that this Friday the 13th, Friday, April 13th, 2018, saw a little stroke of good luck for us, as I like to see it. So I believe in front of you there is a letter that we received at Toronto Public Health from the Minister of Health this past Friday afternoon. And as you'll see in front of you, it does indicate that the Minister of Health was pleased to announce last Friday a 2% base funding increase to all boards of health for the provision of public health programs and services. Further, the Minister of Health, Dr. Helena Jasic, also announced an additional 1% increment to be allocated based on local need, as detailed in the Board of Health annual service plans, which were submitted to the Ministry in March, and we did indeed provide that submission to the Ministry, as did our other Board of Health colleagues. So while this is the extent of the details, we have no further details in respect of this announcement. But I did want to call it to your attention as we were on our agenda discussing the 2018 operating budget. We do have plans to connect with our provincial partners to find out specifically what the details of this funding look like, and would be happy to bring back more information as that becomes available to us.
Okay, and I'll ask the clerk to put on a motion that helps facilitate that. It's to request the Medical Officer of Health to report back on options and opportunities regarding this announcement. It's several $1 million, so let's figure out if there's a way to use it. It might mean that we have to go to the city if it's 75-25, but that's your job to provide a very good report and rationale, and we'll figure out the rest at council. Okay. Anything further on this? So with this amendment, all in favor, opposed if any, that's carried. And lastly, there is I think we're calling it number 8. And that is adopting and resourcing a comprehensive federal tobacco control strategy. There's a recommendation there to request the federal Minister of Health to make federal funding available through the new federal tobacco control strategy, which I understand they're wavering on, to support the ongoing work of the tobacco control community. Sure.
Just for my clarification, so is this, because there is still money in the federal budget, in fact, I think it's an increase towards preventing tobacco and smoking, but there are the two national groups, anti-tobacco groups lost their funding. So is this specifically related to those two groups?
Through the chair, yes, amongst those two groups, but I believe there may be other resources that were also lost as part of the cut in funding.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all in favor of this? Opposed, if any? That's carried. We're adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.